I'm particularly happy to introduce Dr. James Pettifer today from Oxford University, in that he was referred to us by Lieutenant Katie Whitcomb, who's now studying it in the UK. So we consider you part of our family, having influenced one of our own charges. As I mentioned, he's a member of Oxford University History faculty in St. Cross College. He is an associate of the Historische Seminar. Okay, I'm going to screw up the German. So in Zurich University, Switzerland, he was born in Hereford, UK in 1949 and educated at King's School, Worcester, Hertford College, Oxford, and the Free University of West Berlin. He has been a senior member of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and visiting professor at the Institute of Balkan Studies, Thessalonica, and was an honorary fellow of the Department of Greek and Byzantine Studies at Birmingham University, UK. He has a number, I can't in this short intro capture all of his publications, but I do want to say for you all who are taking notes today, he's a well-known author of internationally recognized works on the region such as the New Macedonian Question, the Turkish Labyrinth, among others. His most recent book was published in 2012 on the Kosovo Liberation Army Underground War to Balkan Insurgency 1948 to 2001, and forthcoming in 2015 will be an edited book of papers at Oxford History Faculty Conference held in 2012 on the Balkans War from 1912 to 1913. So please give Dr. James Pettifer
Good. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, good, thank you. Well, I'd first like to thank the Academy very much for the invitation. I have spoken at West Point and other places where people wear different colored uniforms, but I've never ever spoken before at a US naval facility. So thank you very, very much indeed, and it's the most beautiful place. I've just had a tour of some parts and you look after your historic buildings in a way which I think many other military organizations could emulate. I teach Balkan history in Oxford, where I was, as I say, fortunate, as we've already heard, about meeting Katie, who's doing very well with us. And we would also, I think, have many links with the US Navy and with the US military, and we have had a flow of Marshall and Rhodes Scholars over many years. And so keep them coming. If any of you think you might like to try, go for it. In discussions with Keith and with other colleagues here and with Mark, I said I would speak today on really where we've got to in the 25 years since the end of the Cold War in the Balkans. When we first broached this subject, I think it shows the truth of the observation made that historians tend to ask questions that are very much conditioned by the preoccupations of their time. Even in that time now of 9 or 12 months since we were in touch, one could think that perhaps the emphasis of a talk ought to change, because with a new situation in Eastern Europe now, it's quite clear that anything which describes the Cold War as having a historical ending in 1989 is not good history. And I'm not proposing to put it forward here. I would just draw your attention to this map, which is the Balkans as they are now. If there are any of you from Greek background, I apologize for the susceptibility of the name of Macedonia, but I have to find what maps I can to illustrate things. But this is what we have now, and as you can see, I think the man from Mars or woman from Mars looking at it, the first thing you would feel is what a lot of small countries. Whereas if I suppose I should have produced really a similar map, so for say 1960, there was possibly really only 5 or 6 countries if you define the Balkans centrally. And of course then the region was dominated by Yugoslavia. The countries which now make up Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia and so on were all in one country then. And this has been the major change since the end of the Cold War. The bloody and appalling wars of the Yugoslav succession, or some people call them the ex-Yugoslav wars, which led to hundreds of thousands of people losing their homes, tens of thousands of people being killed, and a period of chaos and decline which I'm sorry to say is not fully ended, in my opinion. The Balkans at the end of the Cold War in defense and security terms were split straight down the middle, with the Warsaw Pact to the east, which perhaps the most important country strategically was Bulgaria, given it has both the Black Sea coast not far from Russia and also a large landmass and quite sizable army. Romania, which had a very much more unstable relationship with the Warsaw Pact, and then other Warsaw Pact countries then like Hungary. And in between was Yugoslavia, which was not part of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, and the countries which now on the coast are NATO members, like Albania and Croatia, then were not even in the picture at all. So there have been very dramatic changes in the time, you know, your lifetimes really for most of you. I started studying Greece in detail in the 1970s. Greece is the one country really, if you define it as a Balkan country, where the borders have remained exactly the same as they were when I first opened a book about it. But that is not the case with any of the others. So on the security situation, and I am planning to focus most of what I say on that, because this is now important, I think. We have NATO membership on the Adriatic coast, Croatia, Albania and Greece. Montenegro is in Partnership for Peace and has a relatively productive, I think it'd be fair to say, relationship with US forces and with NATO. Kosovo is very much a NATO protectorate in security terms and does not have an army, although it does have a security force which, as my friend who was attached to it for a while, a British officer, said, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And it looks like an army, but no one can call it that yet. And then there is Serbia, which is, in my opinion, now moving back towards the Russian zone of influence. It never completely left it, and although military reform after Milosevic has been attempted, there are many ways in which the army has not changed as much as we would like. You may have seen President Putin had what a friend of mine who's a classicist described as a Roman emperor visit to Belgrade that would have done for a Roman triumph over a small satrapy, she thought, last month. And various military agreements have been signed now between Serbia and Moscow, which we don't know, needless to say, all the details. The respectable side is that they are going on joint training exercises and so on. The less respectable side is there's a lot of rumours about the Russians possibly going to get some kind of base. It won't be exactly called a base, but it will be a quasi-base at Niš, which is marked on the map in South Serbia. But as with other comments of that sort, I'd be grateful if we could keep my remarks under Chatham House rules here. In other words, if you want to quote them, by all means quote what I say, but don't quote it with my name on it, particularly things like that. Looking back, you can say, well, does anything in the Balkans ever change? There is a school of thought which says no, not much. And the reason for that school of thought, which I don't personally adhere to, at least not much, is geography, because as you can see, all these peninsula and these small countries now are jammed between countries firmly in the western camp, like Italy, and on the other side, Turkey, which although it is a NATO member, has an overwhelming Islamic majority and a government which is dedicated to increasing really Islamic influences in society. So in terms of contemporary conflicts, the old conflict structure between the Warsaw Pact side and the NATO side, is now in many ways being replaced by the NATO side, which has expanded, particularly on the Adriatic coast, with Croatia and Albanian admission, is obviously important for the US Navy in a geostrategic sense in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's also very much on the interface with the Middle East in many important senses. Now, many historians would debate whether Turkey is in the full sense a Middle Eastern country or not. The traditional Western position has been it is a secular country which has a Muslim majority. Well, that in the last 10 or 15 years I think has changed. It is now much more a Middle Eastern country in terms of the relationship between Islam and its political structures. That's not to say Turkey as an ally does not have many positive aspects for us. And Turkey does in the end, I think, usually go the right way on many things. But Turkey is changing. I published a short book in 1998, which was called The Turkish Labyrinth, Ataturk and the New Islam, which is not, I think, my best book, but a lot of people never even got as far really as deciding, because one look at the cover and the title, and some people started to get angry because they said there's never going to be a new Islam in Turkey and Ataturk's system will always continue. And I think it was clear it was not doing so then, and it's absolutely axiomatic that it hasn't done so now. The geostrategics also, the key factor here with Turkey is here. The Bosphorus, which is not shown very well on this map, but it is a gap through which very large ships can go, linking the Black Sea with the Eastern Mediterranean. And there, control of the Bosphorus has been an objective of the expansionist side of Russian policy going right back to the 18th century. And it culminated, some people would think, in the 19th, but it's been there in the background. And one of the reasons Turkey is such a key part of NATO is it controls the Bosphorus Straits between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And that is something in your thinking about this region, which whatever else you think about, you do need to think very carefully about that. It means that Russian ships, which have their ports along the south coast of East Russia, and well, unfortunately now also in the Crimea, can easily get to the Mediterranean quite quickly without any hindrance. For that reason, Russian relations with Turkey are very important. This is something which I don't have time today in this talk to go into, but again, if you're interested in this subject, that's something I should have a good look at, because throughout recent history, the two have moved into more and more links. Turkey is now a thoroughly industrialized and productive country, but it depends very heavily on Russian gas in order to do that, in the same way that Germany does in energy issues. So, going back to the point I made, does anything change? Well, in geostrategic terms, no, because an awful lot of historical conflicts are influenced by human geography, and the human geography of this region doesn't change very much. The actual word Balkan is a Turkish word that means mountain, and it was coined by the Ottomans for the Balkan region, and it is this difficult barrier with many different peoples of different religions, different languages, different ethnicities, all in the same place. And this continual pressure, really, since the mid-19th century, of what used to be called pan-Slavic influences, in other words, nowadays we'd say Russian foreign policy influences, coming from the East, and the need to try to stabilize the region in the West. It is for this reason, I think, that in particular Croatia was given very early admission to NATO, and then Albania, before many people might feel they had a society which fully embodied the sort of values you'd like to see in NATO members. But they were so important at the end of the Cold War to keeping NATO security in the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see this too with Albania. Whatever we think of Enver Hoxha, the Albanian dictator, as a notorious gangster regime of its time, really, that did appalling damage in many ways to its people. But Enver was not completely stupid, and he realized the one great asset he had was the Adriatic coast. And he wrote extensively about his quarrels with Russia, which at that time were in the international communist movement, which were largely about the submarine pens, which were placed here, most of them near Vlora. You can if you go to Albania, you can still see the remains of some of them now. And Russia was treating Albania like, wouldn't even call it a colony hardly, and the Albanians didn't like it, and they quarrelled. And Albanians are rather good at quarrelling with superpowers, which I think sometimes in Washington people should think about that. But at any rate, these countries were admitted, and I think Montenegro has also been given a pretty easy ride on some things, given what sort of problems there are with governments and legality and so on, in order to try to keep the coast solid for NATO. In this sense then, if you look at this, you can see the central importance of the projection of sea power to NATO and to US interests generally. You are going into a terribly important service, not just in terms of defending the United States and the Constitution of the United States, but in terms of the way US power is projected in the strategic sense, in this case, what we're talking about today, in a very important region of the world. That's not to say that NATO is not developed in other ways. I mean, NATO obviously played a key role in Macedonia and in Kosovo during that conflict, and NATO air power very, very much through United States Air Force. But in the end, exercising land power through armies is very difficult in the Balkans. If you read Balkan history in any period, right back to antiquity and ancient Rome, going right, and then later on Byzantium and through the Ottoman Empire, it has been very, very difficult for foreign armies to make much headway if they come into conflict with local population. My most recent book was about the Kosovo Liberation Army as an insurgent army and underground political movement. And the more I worked on this book, which took about 7 years altogether, the more I came to be convinced that how stupid it is to try to exercise political power in the Balkans through military force on the ground. This is something which Slobodan Milosevic never understood, in my view. Sorry for the commercial break. There is going to be a second one. Everyone in the United States is used to watching advertisements. But, I wrote an earlier book, which actually is a bit of an easier read, called Kosovo Express, which was more about the media and the war, which is you could also have a look at, or at least dip into, without necessarily ploughing all through it, because that illustrates some of these issues about Cold War transition. This, I think, takes us on to the positive side of things, perhaps now for a few minutes. There have been many, many improvements in Balkan life since the end of the Cold War, in all countries, I think it's fair to say. Material life has improved considerably. You have free shops, you have small enterprises of various sorts. Agriculture has perked up quite well in many places. And you have an atmosphere of energy and some investment, because a lot of the countries, say like Albania, Macedonia, have large diaspora emigre populations. In this visit to the United States earlier this week, I visited a Macedonian church where I know the priest at a place called Tetowa in Jersey. And there are quite a lot of Macedonians live around Tetowa, which I only discovered fairly recently, but there's diasporas all over the place. The Albanians have a very large diaspora, a particularly important part of which is in Italy. The Kosovo Albanians have a very important diaspora in Germany and Switzerland. And as I try to illustrate in my KLA book, without the Swiss diaspora, I think it's very unlikely they could have been as successful as they turned out to be. But these people have good jobs. I mean, who wants to refuse Swiss francs? Nobody. And Swiss francs can come home and they can rebuild grandma's house, and they can, if you get fed up with repairing the roads in Zurich, you can go home and open a shop. And this culture has been very, very beneficial, and it would not exist under communism in any recognizable form, really. That's the good side. The bad side, I think, in society is the social product has been diminished a lot. In other words, in somewhere like Albania, Serbia, now, if you need to go to the doctor, you have to pay. And you can have to pay a lot. And if you have a serious illness, it's a financial catastrophe for the family. Under communism, there was a very mediocre, but there was a free and universal health service, and education was free. Now schools often have to be paid for if they're any good. And these problems need to be addressed, I think, because it's not to the advantage of social stability to have an impoverished and not educated big chunk of the population. The argument which you sometimes find, I find some of the more annoying op-ed articles in the Wall Street Journal, that all these problems are going to be solved by immigration is not true. Sure, many people will emigrate, but many also will stay. And in particularly in these societies, people will never give up the family land. Having got it back from communist collectivization, people will die for a patch of land this size, which is mostly stones. So there has to be social reform as well. Market reform is not enough in itself to produce social stability, at least in my view. What else do we need to look at as any kind of matter, that will affect you in your careers? I think the key issue is now, of course, Russia. Some of us felt, who were regarded, I think, as rather elderly cynics, but even at the time of the Milosevic trial, when he went to The Hague, there was a feeling that we were making again the old mistake of getting rid of the bad guy at the top, which would then mean the whole situation would be transformed down below. Well, that doesn't happen. We've seen the difficulties that created in some aspects of the wars in Iraq and in Libya, and it's certainly the case in Serbia that many, many social structures in which the Milosevic regime rested on have remained very, very unchanged. And I think there is a reason for this, because it was obviously important to try to form democratic governments after the fall of Milosevic, and that's difficult to do outside anyway, as we've found elsewhere in the world, but it's particularly difficult if you've got a country which, after all, whatever you might say about Serbia, had the first parliament in the Balkans back in the beginning of the 19th century, has had long traditions of free speech, a relatively free media, and many things which it was assumed would lead to a rapid social change. Well, unfortunately, they haven't. What are the reasons for this? Well, this is a very complex issue, which is not time to go into this morning, but one thing you might think about is agriculture. Serbia produces tons and tons of very good food, and the traditional market, going right back to Tito's time in Yugoslavia, was Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and places to the east. Now, those markets have been flourishing. There's no need, in the views of the sort of Serbian agriculture barons, to join the EU, because we can sell every chicken we can produce straight away to Moscow. And of course, those are deals which are not done on the basis of standards of transparency and so on, which we would expect in big public companies doing this stuff. So there's a whole lot of people with very strong vested economic interests in keeping at least some aspects of the old system going. The second reason is that Serbia has genuine security problems. I tried to suggest in my KLA book that one of the recurrent themes of Serbian history in the 20th century has been the establishment of a stable southern border. Because after all, Macedonia here only came into existence in 1991, although it was within Yugoslavia a component entity. But before Socialist Yugoslavia in 1945, it was actually South Serbia, and it was called Banovina, as the name of the Serbian administrative division, and that was all part of Serbia, and the Serbian border actually met Greece, or at least the royalist Yugoslav border met Greece directly. And there are very strong cultural traditions in these matters. The Serbian border now has been pushed way back and is, as you can see, going up towards central Serbia. And many Serbs feel insecure about this, and they feel that they are insecure about their relations with Kosovo. And this leads to a feeling that we need a strong army and strong security service, maybe even a secret police and all the other things which we thought would disappear quite quickly after Milosevic. But they haven't, and I think that is the reason for that. It is not a conspiracy. It rests on genuine, if somewhat paranoid, fears. Relations with Croatia have improved, but Croatia is a country with many internal problems itself, although it does have a great degree of prosperity because of the big tourist income from the Adriatic coast, which the other countries don't. But relations with Croatia are bound to be sometimes tense, given the bloodshed and mayhem there was only very much within living memory. So these sort of problems remain, and I come on last, perhaps, in this to Bosnia. I was in Sarajevo this spring on the anniversary of doing an event they had on the anniversary of the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand, which, as you know, effectively set off the First World War. But Bosnia remains in a very difficult state, subdivided ethnically into three entities. The Serbian part, I think, would like probably to join Serbia in an ideal world, and the Muslim part has nowhere else to go. They have very few friends, and with the climate in Western population opinion changing all the time towards Islam, the chances of them getting statehood, I think, are very small. And equally, the Croatian part, Bosnia in the northwest, I think already in many functional senses is part of Croatia. And so all these problems remain. It's very important, I think, that we don't forget the Balkans. You know, the media in particular are a bit like a lighthouse. You know, the light swings around, you get a brilliant light illuminating something for a while, and then you go into total darkness. And is a bit what's happened, I think, with understandably, given the wars in the Middle East and the other issues, the rise now of organizations like ISIS and so on, which demand UK and US military action. But the Balkans remain on the interface between the East and the West, and their internal problems have an unfortunate habit of spilling over elsewhere. There is the famous old phrase from the British novelist Saki in the beginning of the 20th century, who wrote in one of his stories that the Balkans produce more history than they can consume. And that has been the case, really, for most of the 20th century, on and off. You get these periods of quiet and apparent immobility, and then suddenly the switch clicks and everything changes. So it's important, in my view, as a policy issue, that NATO keeps its commitment there, and in some places I think there are things that could be done which would strengthen it. In particular, I think it's high time Kosovo was allowed to have its own army. It does exist as a functional force already, and it's been UK and US policy, as far as I'm aware, for some years that it should have an army and should be one. But the decision has been blocked by the Europeans within NATO on grounds that it could destabilize the situation. Well, I don't think now it will. The people who are destabilizing the situation militarily are starting, unfortunately again, to be coming from Russia. If these base agreements and training agreements and all these things which we don't really yet know about, or at least certainly I don't, if they come to fruition, then effectively, militarily, Serbia is going to be a suburb of Moscow, a suburb of Russia. And that will demand a Western response, I think, given the behavior of the Russian leadership on general issues in Ukraine and elsewhere at the moment. Bulgaria is in a poor state and is also subject to very strong Russian influences. These are historic, they're not in any way wrong, going back to the Battle of Plevna in the 19th century, but they are there, and Bulgaria has not benefited from EU membership, really, and has all sorts of serious problems. So my last observation to you would be, I think that NATO needs to keep its commitment and keep up its guard, and then we shall see, I think, genuine stability, but that does not mean going back to the Cold War in its old form. But of course, because of Yugoslavia's anomalous position, we didn't have the Cold War in its old form anyway. So there is, in fact, perhaps a better foundation to get new relationships than one might think. And on note of qualified optimism, I will finish my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. We have some time to field some questions before you go into your classes.
Yes, sir.
Question in third class is, sir, what do you think was the key to keeping Yugoslavia together during the Cold War years?
That sounds like a good title for your first book. I think you had a combination of things. You had external powers who had a very strong influence in wanting to see Yugoslavia as a barrier against Russian influence in the Balkans. And Tito's break with Stalin in 1948 seemed to make that possible. Secondly was money. I mean, Tito received an awful lot of aid, particularly actually from the US. Some people think 800 million, which I know doesn't sound that much nowadays, but in the 1950s and 60s that was an awful lot of money. It was a very big proportion of US foreign aid after the Marshall Plan had wound down and, you know, the Central Europe was sort of stabilized. You had an effective democratization of communism in some respects, particularly the workers' councils in factories, which are actually now very similar to if you go into a factory in Germany. They're very similar in their way of involving the workers in the production process. And Moscow was allowed enough influence there to not feel excluded. And this is the subject, I think, will be the subject of a lot of PhDs. And there has already been material written about it, because, of course, what we didn't realize was, possibly, with the arrival of Milosevic in the late 1980s, was the fact that the Russians still had quite a lot of leverage, more than we realized. And the Russian side was there, and so when Milosevic needed it, he could pull that handle and open up, and that was a source of very substantial amounts of money too, as I indicated in what I said. I mean, food exports and things from Serbia, the harvest, grain harvest and so on, mostly sold to Russia, very important. And I think one of Putin's objectives now, this is just a private observation, and please remember we are at Chatham House rules, my personal opinion, one of Putin's main next objectives will be to get business organizations like Cargill and the big US food companies out. They're already closing, apparently, in parts of Ukraine, and I think their tenure in Russia is going to be probably limited.
Starting with McDonald's.
Oh, well, McDonald's, not McDonald's, but we have to be careful what we say about McDonald's, because one of the
Chatham House rules for Mark Rees.
yes, one of the largest private shareholders in the US in McDonald's is the richest Albanian American. He's a good guy. I know him. So mustn't be nasty about the burger.
Yes, sir.
Mm.
Afternoon, sir. Third class morning. I was asking specifically about Turkey. You mentioned how they're pivoting more to the Middle East and looking towards the Middle East for allies. There's a specific situation the previous lecturer discussed about how Turkey's unwilling to work with us on ISIS because they feel Assad is the greater threat. Is there something the United States can do to combat this mindset and get them more on our side, or do you think this shift towards an Islamic State is permanent?
Well, I think what you say is certainly true. I mean, and I did see a little bit of this myself 2 years ago, because if one is allowed personal remarks, the lady in my life is a very serious Byzantinist historian, and much more famous than me. And we did a research trip to southeast Turkey, right to the border with Syria, and it was quite clear to us. I mean, I was very much in non-work mode and trying just to appreciate these wonderful buildings and the interesting mixture, Orthodox Christians, different sorts of Islam and so on. But it was absolutely clear in the middle of quite sizable Turkish towns like Sanliurfa, there was an open, more like Al-Qaeda recruiting desk, and you were invited to sign petitions and give money. And I met quite an agreeable guy who spoke English, who visited the UK once, and he said, yes, we are jihad, and this is very helpful, and do you want to know more about Islam? And I said, no, thank you, not today. But, you know, this has been going on for too long, unfortunately. But the politics down there are very difficult, because the Kurds are a big minority. They are increasingly self-confident. We were very impressed by the improvement in conditions in Diyarbakir, the biggest Kurdish city, for all sorts of people, different Islamic sects and also Christians. We attended a church there, and it was very impressive, and you didn't feel at all threatened or anything. But they are now wanting national minority rights as a minimum, which of course Ankara could never concede in real terms in modern Turkey, and so it's very difficult for Mr. Erdogan. I mean, I think he's always being blamed for things, but I don't quite see, he hasn't got a lot of, you know, as you say, wiggle room. Is that, you know, he hasn't got many policy choices, or serious language. But I think the Turkish public are not idiots. You know, you have an informed public now in Turkey. It's not like 2 generations ago. You have quite good newspapers. You do have some freedom in the media, providing you don't go too far in certain directions. And people know what ISIS is like. You know, you have CNN Turkey, which puts a pretty straight line on that. And I think, you know, Turkey has to move slowly. One must never forget, sorry, I'm talking too much to you guys, but you must never forget, it's not on the map, Turkey has 11 foreign borders with different places. And sitting in Ankara, you don't do things in a hurry, whatever you do, because, and the Sultan didn't either in the Ottoman system. You have to balance this and think, if we do this against the Russians, what will the Americans think? What about that? What will people down in Syria do? It's not easy for them. But I think in the end, Turkey kind of gets there in the end, and I think we are seeing that in the moment. But what I don't understand is, because after all, it is against the law there, and Turkey has suffered a lot from terrorism from different sources of different people. But if you've got what you know, we saw open recruitment and fundraising going on in main square. You know, that can be stopped. And that, I hope, has stopped now, but you know, I'm not sure I'd put too much money on it. So does that answer the question? Sorry, it's rather circuitous. Yeah.
You mentioned that Russia had been courting Serbia quite a bit recently. Have the Western powers been doing anything to either counter that and similar actions, or are we making our own bid with that, or are we just kind of letting that happen?
Sorry, I missed the beginning. You said the beginning.
You mentioned that Russia has been courting Serbia quite a bit recently.
Yes.
Have we been doing anything to counter that?
Well, this is one issue which I think NATO will have to think about, but of course it's a difficult issue because Kosovo is still a divisive within the NATO and the EU, and although within NATO things sort of happen all right, the European Union has not got a united policy on Kosovo. There was a very interesting speech made by the Russian ambassador to Kosovo, well, sorry, the head of Russian office in Kosovo. They don't have an embassy, obviously, but he said about 2 months ago that he thought they should partition the north, where most of the Serbs are, and the Albanians should get the Preševo Valley, which is a strip here, which is actually much narrower than this map shows, but it is Albanian majority populated. Many people would feel that it's a very dangerous policy, not because it comes necessarily as an idea from Moscow, but because it involves changing two borders, and the history of trying to change borders in the Balkans is that very, very rarely happens peacefully in any historical period. So I tend to see, I mean, who knows the way Mr. Putin thinks, but he is a master politician, I think. We are dealing, unfortunately, with a great politician. And the sooner everyone realises this, he's not just some little Napoleon who likes riding on a motorbike. You are dealing with an artist here. And one of the things, I think it's like sport, you know, if you watch a great baseball player, cricketer or anything, people can do things with an absolute economy of effort. Putin doesn't go any further than he needs at the time, usually, to achieve the things he wants. He wants to neutralise Serbia and keep it out of NATO. But I think what he's just done, and this was a Roman emperor visit, has done that. I mean, it would be completely impossible for the mission now. But that's the way. That's enough, I think, for the time being. They have the capacity to create problems in Kosovo. I think for a very small country, you know, population about the same as Rhode Island or something, no, bigger than that, but not much. But there is a very large Russian office in Kosovo with quite a lot of floors, and I think we probably all know what goes on the top floor. And Kosovo is an important watchtower for them in all sorts of senses. And they also have to decide what to do. If you just look at it as if you're sitting in Moscow, you have to decide what to do about relations between Macedonia and Greece, because Macedonia now is very energy dependent on Russia, and they're also selling a lot of food and wine and things to Russia, and the church has a pretty good relationship with the Russian church, I think largely as a counterpoint to pressures from the church in Serbia and Greece. On the other hand, there are also very strong links, again where the church is important, between Greece and Russia. And Putin, I think, is thinking more about this area, because it also fits in well with their central strategic focus on the Bosphorus and the traditional, you know, Russian interests. Greece, I think, will be a country to watch this coming year. There's been a sort of relative stability for a year or two, but that could well change, particularly if they can't find a president, because they're not going to be able to.
Let's thank Mr. Pettifer for his time.
We've got to go, have
I wanted to present you with a book.
Oh.
I'm sorry, were there any more questions? Or
this chap at the front's been waiting
I'm
a while.
sorry.
Just quickly take, if we can make it quick, I'll make it quick too.
Bulgaria is bad condition right now.
Well, The economy is not very good, and you've still got this grip of what everyone in Bulgaria calls the mafia. I mean, I don't know if that's a very scientific term, but you know, I've got a good friend who works for a bank in Bulgaria, and he takes the view that it doesn't really matter who the elected government is, because the real power centres are quite outside the elected assemblies. And these kind of things everyone hoped would improve with EU membership, and they haven't. And emigration is terribly high. I mean, if you live in provincial Bulgaria, I mean, his family live in Mikhailovgrad, which is not a poor place particularly, but you know, just no doctors. And the ones there are, you've got to pay the earth to see. And this kind of thing is not what we hoped for from a country with EU membership. You know, this is the problem, and it's not that I'm not. I mean, I like Bulgaria. I've written a book about Bulgaria. I have many friends there, but there is something about. I don't know. You know, some people go, you know, well, there's something in the water supply, but things are not going well. And the Russians have tons of money, and they just buy things. And if you buy things, like any other country, you get political influence. Particularly on the Black Sea coast, you know, they're buying a lot. Do you have a link with Bulgaria, may I ask?
I'm Bulgarian.
I thought so, yeah. What do you agree with what I've said?
Yes, sir.
You don't have to, you know. No.
I was asking more like historically speaking, like what led to this situation.
I think I'll have to pass on that one, because I think that would take us to even start. That would take us beyond, you know, our appointed time. But thank you all very much. You know, yeah.
You can't come to the Naval Academy. Let me sneak in here real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't come to the Naval Academy without our ubiquitous gift.
Sorry.
Just a little memento for his trip. We had a copy of
Oh,
your
that's
poster
wonderful.
that you
Oh,
can
thank
frame
you.
as well. So
That's
thank you very
wonderful.
much.
Thank you very much
You're
indeed.
welcome.
Great.